All right, so we have some newcomers here, but it's just going to be a second to get started. Okay. You know, whenever you want, I can show you the code again. If you need to register. For your eyes only.
Special gift just for setting up.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a special service of mine. You good? Yeah. All right. Okay, then let's recap a little bit what the recording said about decisions under uncertainty. So to remind ourselves, we had already discussed judgment of probabilities, judgment under uncertainty. And now in this lecture, there were basically two topics to talk about, which was prospect theory in order to think about evaluation of lotteries. And then I snuck in some theory of consumer choice, which is mental accounting, not because it relates so much to the evaluation of lotteries or risk preferences, but just because it's, I think, an interesting theory of consumer choice. Certainly, it's possibly the most relevant one or the most prominent one for economists. So I think that's useful to then go through. And then in terms of the risk preferences, we had this sheet of gambles, A and B, that I asked you to do, and then we basically came back to that during the recording, and we will see some of them again now. So basically, we started with looking at expected utility and spelling out the kind of assumptions and tenets or axioms that are behind expected utility, so that it's an expectation. Expected utility is an expectation construction of probabilities and utilities, that we integrate assets, meaning that we consider the utility function in terms of final states of wealth, and then we can talk about risk aversion if the utility function small u is concave. And then I showed you the axioms that are expected from decisions under risk in order to be able to represent preferences with a utility function. Yeah, so we had completeness, transitivity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, and then continuity, which did allow for Neumann and Morgenstern to say that if these are satisfied, and I guess for a long time it was reasonable to claim that these axioms are usually satisfied by your risk preferences, then we can represent preferences with a utility function in a way that whenever the utility of A is greater than the utility of B, this would indicate that you prefer gamble A over gamble B. And it does allow discussion of different risk attitudes like risk aversion, risk neutrality, and risk lovingness. But then we kind of quickly jumped into the LA paradox, which was the first main paradox to show that there was something with expected utility that was maybe unexpected or not working so well. And here you recall maybe that there were these two choices that the crowd in the experiment was predominantly making different. So it chose B in 1 and A in choice 10, but it would boil down to the same inequality in terms of expected utility, just with a different sign, right? So that was the LA paradox, which was the first big question to be raised against expected utility. So this is violating, these choices are violating the independence of the irrelevant alternatives axiom. All right. And then, so we set up prospect theory as it was spelled out by Kahneman and Tversky in 1979. There have been other versions of prospect theory in later years, but the main theory is still intact and still very useful to know. So here we are dealing, as I said, with products between the weighting function and the value function. And it's in these two functions where we see the differences with expected utility. So the value function, very importantly, having these three characteristics of being defined on deviations from the reference point, rather than just looking at your final wealth state. Here they are generally concave for gains, convex for losses. So you behave differently depending on whether you think about gains or losses from your reference point. And then it's steeper for losses because losses hurt us more for a given magnitude than gains. Okay, so that's the value function. And the weighting function is here indicated and contrasted with the 45-degree dotted line, showing that there's overweighting of small probabilities and then underweighting of larger probabilities. And there are discontinuities, if you will, at 0 and at 1, where the weight of 0 is 0 and the weight of 1 is 1. All right. Yeah, and then we can basically come back to this paradox and explain that as prospect theory says, if you get something like in choice 1, gamble B, with certainty that has a higher weight than things that have payoffs with a probability of, for example, 0.33, as in choice 10, gamble A. And that is why people are very attracted to B, but when B in the choice 10 is not yielding a certain gain, then it might be quite quickly preferred to, or A might be preferred to B then quite quickly, depending on what the irrelevant alternative is and how they are framed, these gambles. All right. Then we saw some other effects. So here, this effect is called common consequence, because there are some consequences between choice 1 and choice 10 that are actually in common. So choice 1 and choice 10 only differ by an irrelevant alternative. And we will talk about that in more detail in the workshop. But then there's also an effect that is called common ratio, where if you divide the probabilities of, for example, choice 2 by 4, then you also reverse preferences. And that is, again, due to the certainty that you find in gamble B of choice 2, but you don't find that anymore in gamble B of choice 11. There's another way of putting that if you have the outcomes not necessarily in monetary terms, but in terms of these trips. Then you see the same effect if you have certainty for a tour of England, that is much more attractive than to have a relatively small chance of this tour of England. And that is the same common ratio in the sense that the probabilities are just cut by a factor of 10. And here we see the same, just with different levels of probability. So if you take a probability that is almost 1, but it's not exactly 1, but then you transfer that into a very, very small probability, then this is also sufficient to make this switch from B to A. Then we were looking at what happens when you, instead of looking at gains, you look at losses. And in choice 2, if you change the sign of the outcomes into losses, you see that you also reverse preferences, right? So the certainty all of a sudden makes B very unattractive, which B previously was benefiting from, if you will, because it even though it only yielded 3,000, it was preferred over something that yielded 4,000 with 0.8. And the same we see if we go into these probabilities that are not hitting 1. If we prefer A in choice 11, now under losses, we prefer B. And that shows that indeed we see risk aversion in the gain domain and risk seeking in the loss domain. So that's coming back to one of the main characteristics of the value function. There's an isolation effect in that if you describe that these probabilities actually are 0.2 and 0.25 because of the probability of getting to these gambles the way that they are described, then you see that people still react to the way the gambles are described rather than the overall probability of yielding 4 or 3,000. So here we see that there's a preference for B, even though if you had the probabilities 0.2 and 0.25, we would expect a different choice. So this violates indeed the notion that probabilities of final states are decision relevant. What is decision relevant is the probability of the substage of this game. So stage 2 of this game, as it is shown here. Here we have a graphical way of showing the difference between choice 7 and choice 11, and making yet again the point that we do not always look at these final state probabilities, but we might be influenced by the probabilities shown at a substage. Has anyone heard of the term narrow bracketing before? Yeah, I'm thinking about this now. Currently I have a study that relates to this to some extent, where instead of having lotteries, we are taking games and then we are splitting them up into basically 2 lotteries. So we are calling these games compound games because they are made up of 2 games that are played at the same time, if you will, and where you have to take the same decision. So it's similar to this. And so lotteries have been investigated because of this effect that people isolate or narrow bracket, and they will be influenced by the framing of this subgame more than by the integration, integrating this into the entire game for which you take a decision. And quite interestingly, you can see this narrow bracketing that has been established in lotteries. You can see that in games as well. If you take so what we did, we took a Battle of the Sexes game, and you can divide it into a part that is a pure coordination game, and then there's a remaining Battle of the Sex game. I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with this, but basically you can show then by splitting off this main game a component that people are usually very happy to coordinate on. So it's a game where you see relatively high coordination rates, while in the Battle of the Sexes game, you often don't see high coordination rates. But if you then split this Battle of the Sexes game into 2 games that are played at the same time, of which one is a pure coordination game that doesn't have any of these conflict of interest as the Battle of the Sex game has, then you can show that you can increase the coordination rate of the entire game, which is a Battle of the Sex game, just because people will be narrow bracketing on the sub-game, one of the component games, if you will, that is a pure coordination game that usually lends itself quite easily to coordination success. So yeah, that's kind of why I think of narrow bracketing, because you can think of this way of looking at sub-games in terms of a 2-stage game or a 2-stage lottery as choice 7. But we are currently also looking at that when we are looking at compound games as opposed to compound lotteries. Anyway, that's just as a parenthesis on this topic. If you combine the two, so here we have isolation and reflection effect, then you can see that depending on how you tell a story in choice 8 or in choice 16, even though the final outcomes are the same, depending on how you tell the story, you will change what the majority would prefer. So the majority prefers B in 8 and A in choice 16. And that's basically purely because of the way that you frame the description of the lottery. And that again would be due to the fact that you narrow bracket on the description of the lottery after you've been described what you have been given. So you don't integrate that into what the final states are that you are confronted with. And I think that's quite interesting, and kind of yet again, like last time, making the point that there's a process that you go through, and sometimes this process is not very useful to make good decisions, because the process of reasoning seems to always pay attention to the way that these subgames or individual lotteries are described, rather than kind of integrating what the big picture of the situation is. All right. So we had a small probability overweighting that was reflected in the weighting function, and this can be seen in choice 9 and 17, where we do see a switch in attitudes from basically risk-seeking in the positive domain and risk aversion in the negative domain, which is basically described by this overweighting of the small probabilities. All right, any questions so far? Any comments on this material? If that's not the case, then let me continue with mental accounting, where I guess you can tell interesting stories how people have separate accounts that they do not integrate. Talking about narrow bracketing again, if you will, where you don't transfer your maybe winnings from the stock market to your evening poker game. But of course, if you have winnings in your poker game, then that would be very much in your mind as something strengthening your position. Or we had the example where two people were saving for their vacation home, and they didn't want to jeopardize the savings when they bought a new car, even though the financing is more expensive for the car than the interest that they earn on the money saved for the vacation home. And so on the basis of this anecdotes, we had some further questions for you in terms of valuation of events and trading choices that we came back to then later. But basically, this model of consumer choice includes three main differences between economic utility maximization, as economists think, and a description of maybe something that consumers rather do than this general utility maximization. So here there are three main ingredients that are different. One is the value function that we know from prospect theory, that we think this is also how people make some consumption decisions. Then there's a transaction utility involving a reference price and spelling out a transaction utility, which is basically indicating how good a deal was that you went through. And then finally, fungibility, that you have different accounts for different kinds of consumption with their own internal maximization process and their own shadow price, but which sometimes prevent you from optimizing across accounts. And when we look at the value function, we see that sometimes this makes predictions as to how you should deal with multiple gains, multiple losses, or mixed gains, mixed losses. And these quite quickly derive from the value function that we know from prospect theory. And I think the message is, we might be quite familiar with these, that you don't wrap all Christmas presents in one box, that you pool small losses into one large one. And of course, if you have a gain and a loss where the gain is more sizable, then this feels still pretty positive. And a mixed loss might be, depending on the exact magnitude of the loss versus the gain, but it might be that there's a silver lining segregation of a small gain in a generally bad situation of a loss. Okay, so this is kind of relating to the valuation of events in this document that I showed you. And then the transaction utility, I think, is an interesting concept as well, where not only do we have acquisition utility, where we, as in standard theories, we compare the actual price of the product with the value equivalent of the product, P bar. But there's also a term that compares the price of the product with the reference price of this product. And so this might yield some transaction utility if the price is particularly low compared to the reference price. And here, this reference price basically brings us that we can talk about the context of a decision. So even if the price and the value of a product was the same, there were some scenarios where you purchase this product in a fancy resort or in a rundown grocery, where you might have different attitudes as to what is the reference price that you might be willing to pay. So this transaction utility allows us to bring this into the theory, that we can talk about the context of a consumption decision, which would otherwise be left out of the equation in more traditional theory. Okay, and then the fungibility of these different accounts that you create, that is kind of getting us into monthly budgets or category budgets that people have. So going out for dinner with friends might violate the monthly or food budget constraint, while if you were maximizing your utility without any of these accounts, then all shadow prices might be or would be the same. Yeah, so I think that's leaving us already with the implications of mental accounting, which is to some extent a marketing recap of what this theory tells us. It was, I think, published in a marketing journal. So I think this can therefore speak to that. Right. Are there any questions on this or any comments about mental accounting? So what I find interesting about mental accounting, if you look into financial literature where you get some help on how to manage your finances as a private person or a private household, basically the first thing that you will be told is that you should do exactly this, right? That you should start to have a budget, make categories for your spendings, and then do exactly what is described here, right? So then from an economic point of view, you might think then, okay, it might be better to have a monthly budget and category budgets than no budget at all. and just spend widely. But as an economist, you would then say, okay, it's a good thing to have these budgets, monthly budgets, category budgets, but that's not the end of the story. So you can do even better than that by also looking at the situation in different accounts and possible gains from trade between accounts, just as we saw with this couple that was looking into buying a car at the same time saving for their vacation home. So yeah, it's quite interesting that this seems that this observation here about the fungibility or non-fungibility of these accounts seems to come straight out of what people are actually told about what they should do if they have maybe lost control over their finances. All right, yeah, but that's the recap from today and what we talked about in terms of decisions under uncertainty. So are there any comments or any questions related to that? Anything that remains unclear or that relates to this, maybe something that relates to your personal interests or any anecdotes of your own relating to how to deal with risk and how to deal with consumption choices?
If you go back a few slides, actually, to where you had the two options and how they've been framed, I can't remember exactly where it was.
It was in the this one.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
One more. Yeah, that. Is that more to do with how it's framed, or more to do with people not having a basic understanding of maths? Because in both of those, the probabilities are just one is double the other.
Yes, yes.
And so are they saying that people don't actually look for that? All they look for is what they can gain and how it's presented to them? Because surely anyone, if you were being told to compare the two, would see that's double that, so therefore it's effectively the same.
Right. I mean, one has to say...
I know in terms of chances, and how it's presented to you, it is. If that makes any sense.
Right. I mean, but what do you relate to the fact that now you have the benefit maybe of seeing choice 4 and 13 at the same time, and then you can look for consistency across the two?
I presume they're all presented to you at once.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
I'm not sure how it was in the original experiment, so it could be that they were part of the same experiment, but it might not be. So I'm not sure whether the same people saw these two choices.
It might just be how it's presented.
Yeah. And I would think that even though maybe, I don't know how it was for you or how you felt when you went through this document, I think even if it is shown to the same person, I'm not quite sure whether, if choice 4 and then you did other choices and now you come to choice 13, I'm not quite sure whether you would still have choice 4 in mind as something to be consistent with.
I think I only noticed it because it's been presented like that.
Yeah.
So, I think I've answered my own point.
Yeah. And it's funny that you say this, because what you're describing, if you will, is also some sort, it's not exactly, but it's also some sort of narrow bracketing, or, you don't have the overview that you can compare yourself to choice 4, which you just did. But you look at choice 13 to some extent in isolation, and then what you said on choice 4, it doesn't bother you anymore, however you decided that. But it's true that once you do this, you might be confronted with what you think is an inconsistency, just based on the probabilities indeed and how they relate. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Which brings me, it's kind of funny to think about that, because I find, imagine yourself with your current knowledge without having any input from the outside. what you're left with, and that's kind of just a thought of mine, a hypothesis. I don't know whether that is truly, correct. But what you can do with your own knowledge now, without getting any data or any information from the outside, is basically you can make advances by checking that your knowledge is consistent across all the knowledge that you have, right? So you can make advances on your own without getting new information, just by checking consistency of everything that you know with everything else that you know. And so this is one occasion where if you had known, well, maybe you would have been able to make a choice in choice 13 such that you would have been consistent with choice 4. And maybe if you just looked at this document for long enough and you didn't have anything else to worry about, maybe you would have spotted this relationship and then you could have made it consistent, right? Yeah, so there's something that you can do in the absence of getting information. You can basically make advances on your own knowledge by looking for inconsistencies in your, in the world, in your internal world, as to how you see what is true and what is not true. And sometimes I'm wondering, is that hopeful? Does it make me hopeful, that even if I don't get any new information from the outside, I could make some advances? Or is it rather, sad that it's only so much that I can do on my own, and just check for consistency or see if there's anything that is inconsistent? But it does have its relationships to established theories in psychology. So, for example, no, I don't get to recall the name of the theory where you are basically uncomfortable if you hold two pieces of information that are not consistent with each other.
Cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance, exactly. Yeah. So if you have that, then there's basically something in your mind telling you that, oh, there's an inconsistency, and you get uncomfortable. You want to somehow resolve that. So that's basically one way of how an inconsistency can manifest itself, by then being uncomfortable about this, these two pieces of information that are available to you. Yeah. Something else that I think in this context is, if you think about the situation of people in Russia with the state media and so forth, I mean, it's very difficult to get out of this, right? If you get this kind of information, then it's not so clear how you, for yourself, how you can find inconsistencies and how you can make advances, about the truth of the world, if you don't have external information that comes to you. So, yeah, that's I guess one consequence of this idea that you can only do so much in gaining knowledge. You can work internally on inconsistencies, but apart from that, you will be left with getting new information, having to then check, kind of do your due diligence as to which piece of information you accept, depending on whether it is consistent with most of the elements that you already know or whether it's not. And so, yeah, I think when you think about it this way, then the quest for knowledge and for truth is actually something that requires a lot of resources, right? You have to be able to take the time, think about these things. And I mean, as economists, we know that it's not that everybody can do that, because everybody's optimizing under constraints in terms of money and time. And then you oftentimes are left with somewhat incomplete knowledge, which is, I mean, yeah, that's just how it is. But yeah, thanks for pointing us to this, to these inconsistencies that, yeah, depending on the perspective, are quite evident or not at all. Yeah. All right. Any other comment or any other thought? No, if that's not the case, then I will let you off the hook. I will see you on Thursday for the workshop, and I will also in the second week after the Easter break, I will be in touch again with you about the lecture on choice architecture. So that's about nudging and so forth. All right, then yeah, let's call it a day, and I will see you on Thursday. Thank you.
Question: are you available during the Easter holidays or not? The emails and questions and stuff like that.
I will be available by email, but I will not be present in Norwich.
That's fine. But,
yes, yeah.